Hello, everybody. Paul here. Today, I want to talk to you about new criticism as a literary theory. Um, what you've been assigned to read is in this book. You have the digital version of it. I'm going to be talking about this book, but I'm also going to be talking about my own ideas about this that I've gained through experience going through um, a lot of theory classes and a lot of teaching of theory, I guess. Um, I mean, I agree with the things that Lois Tyson says in this book, but I also have just some more perspective that I want to give you. I take the book very seriously. I think she's really smart, and I enjoy her takes on things. I am doing what you should also be doing, and that is taking a lot of notes as I go. I highly encourage you taking a lot of notes on the readings that you do because you cannot just hold all this stuff in your head. You're going to need to make a bunch of marks on the paper, help yourself to think through it through writing, and then probably copy your notes down onto a separate sheet or into a separate document on your computer and give yourself an explanation of what these theories actually mean. There's going to be stuff that is kind of hard for you to get to sink in. Whenever I read any theory, I don't completely understand 100% of it right away. What I do is I work on interpreting it, which is the whole deal here, right? And I get my version of it down on paper, and then I continue to try to refine how well I understand it. Um, that's kind of the nature of this sort of work. So, new criticism. This idea is that when you are understanding a work of literature, you want to understand it through the text itself. You want to concentrate on the content of it, so the ideas in it, and also the form of it, so all of the elements of the writing that make it up. In order to do this, you do a close reading. So, close reading, I think, is familiar to everyone who's taking this class, I would think. Um, it's kind of what we do in the study of literature. You look at the text, you think about how it's written and what it means, and you use everything on that page you can to interpret it and come up with what it means. So, in that sense, new criticism is something that we integrate into every single thing we do almost all the time. Um, so before, I just want to situate this a little bit. Before new criticism was around, so like in the late 1800s, early 1900s, people, scholars of literature, tended to do more of like a biographical or historical criticism, where rather than even looking at the text and trying to do an interpretation of it, they just sort of took it at face value. And the study of literature was sort of just taking the authorial intent at face value. So whatever it seemed like the author wanted you to get out of it, you just accepted that. And then you would study the author themselves. You would study biographical traits of the author. You would look at the historical context and what was written in, and you'd have a whole bunch of things to say about kind of extraneous things to the text. New criticism took sort of a radical turn and said, we're not going to look at any of those things. We don't care about the author. We don't care about the cultural, historical context. We're going to look at what exists on the page only, and only use the form and the content that we find on the page to interpret. It's a little bit radical, but it's also, you can understand how it's very, very useful and can also become problematic in some situations, and that is the nature of most literary and critical theory. So embrace it and learn everything you can from it, and just like kind of get excited about all the problems that we're addressing here, okay? Um, so a big contribution of new criticism is that authorial intent is not the same as textual meaning. So what the author wants the text to mean is not simultaneous and the same thing as what the text actually does mean. Now, a lot of different theories can look at both of those things. In new criticism, we're going to ignore the author altogether, and we're going to look just at the text itself and make our own meaning. Now, That does not mean that we just get to make whatever meaning we want and our opinion really, really matters. Actually, in new criticism, there should be one best interpretation of it, and the other ones are wrong. So we are looking for the correct meaning here. Now, again, that's problematic too, right? Because what if you have, um, 5, 6, 7, 100 different literary geniuses who all come up with something different? How can you resolve that, right? It's a mess, and it's also a really interesting and exciting mess that you can learn from. Another thing that new criticism really contributes is that we have to be careful about just liking or disliking something. So they're going to call this affective fallacy. People in academia don't like using the word emotion; they like using the word affect. So whatever, right? But so affective fallacy means that you get an emotion about a work, and that causes you to like it. That's not something new criticism is going to tolerate. We can look at how the form of the work is generating some sort of affective reaction, but we do not want to judge it based on that. And I will get to how do you actually judge work, because unlike some literary theories, new criticism actually does judge the greatness of a work based on a formula, and we'll get to that. Lois Tyson in the book mentioned that new criticism is the only theory in this book that is no longer in practice. Nobody uses it, but yet everyone does use it. So she does acknowledge, like, it's not in practice as an official theory, but it's in practice everywhere. It's been integrated into everything that we do. So really, this is being used, and especially in college classes, this is one of the most powerful tools that I have to sort of encourage all of you to do technical things with the text. When I just showed you all of the note taking that I take on a text like this, what I'm doing is exactly like new criticism. And this is a process that I go through no matter what theory I'm using. I integrate pieces of new criticism. The reason this is indicative of new criticism is that I'm underlining particular things in this text, which means I'm looking at the form, and I'm trying to take all the things that I've taken little notes on, underlined, starred, and circled, and interpret that into some sort of meaning, which means that I am exactly doing new criticism. I just want to mention, Tyson mentions this in the book too, that new criticism, the reason it's not really used anymore is that in the 1960s, sort of the late 60s, there was a big shift in how we do literary criticism. And this kind of has to do with the idea of critical theory. Remember in the beginning, I mentioned that literary theory and critical theory are like this, but you can sort of like start to tease them apart and try to understand, what do we mean by literary theory? What do we mean by critical theory? In the 60s, this idea of critical theory really came around. And critical theory tends to look at power dynamics, and it tends to look at ideologies. And one criticism that I personally have of the current state of literature studies is that the ideas of ideologies have crept in and dominated too much. Now, these ideological like systems that we can look at as critical theory to understand text are really useful, but again, they can also become problematic. And I feel like we're slipping a little bit toward the problematic end of it at this point, but we'll talk about all that later. Tyson says that deconstruction, she feels, is really the movement that sort of killed new criticism. I agree, but I also want to give a different perspective on that. I think that more so we could talk about post-structuralism as the idea that really killed new criticism. Deconstruction is an idea within post-structuralism. Post-structuralism is not a literary field. Post-structuralism is a large cultural phenomenon that literature kind of followed along with. So we will be talking about structuralism, post-structuralism, and deconstruction in this class in a couple of weeks. But right now, I just want you to know that new criticism was something that took the text itself very, very seriously. It was sort of usurped as the main thing that literary critics used in the 60s and ongoing by this more sort of ideological way of doing things that, to me, really represents post-structuralism. back to new criticism. Let's talk about this. What you want to do in new criticism is think about form and content. Those two things can't be separated. When form and content are viewed together, that is what new critics will call organic unity. So what we're looking for is trying to understand the organic unity of each text. So if you're thinking about form and content, form, we're talking about the formal elements. So we're talking about the way the writing itself is structured. We can be thinking about literary devices. We can be thinking about things like metaphors, similes. We can be looking for irony, and she mentions all of these different things. So all of these, literary terms and devices that you have learned, hopefully, in earlier classes before this one, those are the formal elements that make literature what it is. Then you're also going to be looking at the content. So what does it mean, right? So we're not just trying to figure out meaning. We're trying to figure out what is the structure of this thing, and then what does it mean, and how are those things working together? In a weird way, meaning for new critics is kind of set in stone in a weird way. So the way they say it is the form of this text exists already. The form is never going to change. The order of the words on the page are already there. They're set and they're never going to change. Therefore, there is a solid meaning that can be interpreted. It's just that you have to figure out the perfect way to interpret it. What is the correct way to interpret the meaning of this text? Now, later on, after post-structuralism, which is sort of a postmodernist kind of movement, this essentialism gets just pushed out of the way. Everybody says, no, there's not one single meaning to anything. This is not just applied to literature, but this is applied culturally, right? We start to believe that there's a multitude of meanings in everything, and we need to let all these meanings sort of all have their little pathways toward truth, right? In new criticism, we don't really want to do that. We're looking for the best meaning, which exists, in the minds of a new critic. So for better or for worse, the interpretation is going to happen, and you want your interpretation to be right. That understanding the unity, the organic unity of your text, is what actually is the measurement of the quality of the literature. So great works of literature are synonymous with works of literature that have strong organic unity. And remember, the organic unity is the form and the content working together well. So you want the right balance here, right? The content, talking about content as sort of a literary thing is important because, talking about form as a literary thing is important because the form of literature is different from the form of everyday language. So everyday language just kind of gets things done, right? Everyday language is the instructions on the back of a macaroni and cheese box, right? It's utilitarian. It's just day to day, right? If you want to talk about literature, it has a form that is complex, that doesn't have one easily interpreted apparent meaning, even if that meaning is there. So you want to have complexity of form in literature. And complexity is one of the things that's a measure of whether literature is good or not. However, the complexity has to be balanced with order. So we've got complexity and order. We need both of these things, right? Order means that complexity can actually be made sense of. You have to be able to interpret that complexity so that it's resolved, so that you can actually say, what the hell does this thing mean, right? If you have complexity that just can't be resolved, that's just a chaotic mess, and it does not have organic unity. It only has organic unity if you have a whole bunch of complexity and you can actually figure out what that complexity means and resolve it. That is a great work of literature in the eyes of a new critic. So they suggest, four main complexity, Lois Tyson is talking about how new critics suggest basically four main ways that complexity is portrayed. That's paradox, irony, ambiguity, and tension. What those four things have in common, and you should definitely, I'm sure you've already read it in here, but read it in the text itself for yourself. But that just basically means that meaning is not just simply stated like it would be on the back of the instructions of a macaroni and cheese box. It is something that needs to be interpreted because it's complex. It's not nonsensical, it's not random, it's complex. So you find order by resolving these complexities. So understanding what it actually means, being able to explain the complexities. And by doing that, that's where you get your theme. So I know this is the first time I'm mentioning theme, but what the goal of doing a reading for New Criticism is to discover the theme and be able to clearly state it. Making sense of the complexities equals the theme. Let's just see here. So figuring out how form and content create a theme is called a close reading. So let's talk a little bit about close reading. Finding that figurative language, expressing it through the reading, and then explaining how it can be interpreted, that is a close reading. In Lois Tyson's book, there is a part that I'll need to find where she does a close reading of a poem. It's this one here, and your pages are different because you have the digital copy, but there's a close reading of a poem here. And it's Lucille Clifton's There Is a Girl Inside. And when you look at the reading that Lois Tyson does of this poem, you'll see that there is a lot of language directly from the poem. She is quoting lots and lots of language here. And she's not just like quoting a line and then trying to explain what that line is. She's going deeper and more specific than that. A lot of times she's just showing you specific words and explaining why, and a certain interpretation will show that those words are showing up in there. She's using only the text on the page to do an interpretation of what this means. She's not trying to consider the author's life. She's not talking about historical context. She's not talking about any cultural matters. She's thinking about what is on the page and how we can use the structure of these words to determine what the complex meaning is and tell what the theme is. It's kind of just as simple as that, but I'll talk a little bit more about it. Here's how you can do this in your assignment that's coming up. I want to talk sort of a little bit more practically to you now. You're going to be reading William Butler Yeats' The Second Coming. It's a short poem that just has a couple stanzas. I'm going to want you, read the whole poem and think about it, right? But I'm going to want you to concentrate on one stanza. So that's going to seem like, to some people, maybe a really impossible task to write anything about one stanza. But the thing about looking deeply into literature through theory is you're going to be able to write a lot just on that one stanza. So read it carefully. Think about it. Remember, you're going to be thinking about what's the structure of this thing, the form, and also what does it mean, the content, right? What you're going to want to do is determine what you think is the best expression of the theme of that stanza. Now remember, the theme of the whole poem might not be the same as the theme of just that one stanza. I want you to be thinking about the theme of that one stanza that you choose. So to do this, you'll be using a whole bunch of quoted material right from the stanza. Put it in quotation marks, show it, and explain the complexity of the meaning and give your interpretation of it. Only using the stanza itself. Now you're going to understand things like there are a lot of religious allusions in this, and there are a lot of there's motion happening. There's all kinds of things happening, right? So you in your own mind, you know what some of these things are. So you don't have to pretend that you don't know things, right? But I don't want you going into some sort of second source and saying, well, this means this. You're only using the one stanza as your source and your own mind. What is the best interpretation of the theme? So in other words, how are these complex meanings expressed through form interpreted by you to give the best possible theme of this stanza? So remember, formal elements equal complexity. So the way the writing is put together, means that meaning is in need of interpretation, not just right in front of you, right? And then interpretation is your own thing. That's the content of it. The way the words are on the page and what you say the words mean equals the organic unity. And if you can understand the organic unity, that means that you're going to be able to express some sort of theme that you think that this has. So tell me what you think the main theme of the stanza is based on its organic unity. So demonstrate actual language, give your interpretation of why you think this language means a certain thing, and express what the theme is. That's your task. It's not easy at all. So I don't expect perfection here. What I do expect is that you're not going to be going and finding general stuff online and trying to say things that are general. This is going to be a very, very close, deep, specific interpretation that belongs to you, that you think is the best one. Your assignment is going to be your entire assignment is going to be to read the Yeats poem, pick that one stanza, do one interpretation that is new criticism, and then you're going to be doing another interpretation that's new historicism. That's going to be I'm going to have a separate lecture to explain that other theory, right? So this is only going to be 300 words out of the 600 words that your assignment's going to be. So 300 words will be dedicated to this interpretation. In the same document, I'm going to want you to do a second interpretation using a second theory, but you're going to have to watch my other lecture to talk about that second theory, okay? I hope you can have fun with this. This is kind of where the rubber really hits the road with literary studies. This is the kind of thing that not everybody can do. So being a serious literature person, this is maybe a painful process you have to go through, but I think also feels really exciting to become one of the best people in the world for interpreting literature and expressing it in a certain way. Let me know if you have questions. I'm always available to you, and I'll see you in the next video.